In a world that's always racing forward, sometimes we need to slow down and reconnect.
Connect genuinely, broaden your perspective, and share your passion.
Bonafide dialogues, where authenticity, creativity, and passion merge.
So welcome to Bonafide Dialogues, Sean.
Sean Gourley is the founder and former CEO of Primer, a San Francisco-based artificial intelligence company. Previously, he was the CTO of Quid, a data visualization company he co-founded in 2009. Prior to Quid, Gourley worked on self-repairing nanocircuits at NASA. He holds a PhD in physics from Oxford, where his research as a Rhodes Scholar focused on complex systems and the mathematical patterns underlying modern war. This research was published on the cover of Nature. He is a two-time New Zealand track and field champion. Gourley serves as an independent board director for SERKO, Australian Securities Exchange SKO, and was previously a member of the board of directors at Anadarko, New York Stock Exchange APC. He is an investor in deep technology startups and is a TED follower.
I would like to start by asking you some questions about you. I would like to get to know you better. I know that you have a very successful career, and I wanted to ask, did you have a role model in your life, in your childhood, or who inspired you to be so highly motivated in life?
It's an interesting question. I think of a range of role models across different spaces, and I think for me, obviously growing up with sport as a central part of my life, I think that gave me the competitive aspects of kind of where I am and who I am, and Daley Thompson, the great British decathlete, was always a role model of mine growing up in the track and field space, and just his hyper competitive nature was always wonderful. And so, for that side, I think that was a wonderful role model. I think certainly on the sort of the political side, Nelson Mandela was always someone I looked up to, and was lucky enough to have a chance to meet him a couple of times whilst I was at Oxford, and had a chance to actually kind of connect and meet with him, and that was wonderful to hear.
That's very inspiring, and
connect with him as well. And so there's been a range of role models, and I think also just in business, I still remember I used to get up late at night and watch the Apple keynotes when Steve Jobs was at his peak, and there was no better showman than a keynote from Steve Jobs, and I still think the work he did introducing the iPhone back now in 2007 was still one of the greatest presentations in the business environment that we've seen. So yeah, look, the world is full of exceptional people, and there's a lot you can learn from them, and I certainly consider myself a student of all of theirs.
I was watching a couple of your TED Talks. Do you have two, or did I find all of them?
Yeah, there's two TED Talks, and then I've done a few other TEDx talks that have found their way onto the sites, and I think there's a decent portfolio of them out there. So yeah, hopefully you've seen a few of them.
Yeah, and you're doing really well on stage. Did you take some classes, or it just comes naturally to you?
I think no, I never took any classes in talking. I think for
speaking,
me, yeah, no,
it's not easy. Most people, get nervous, but you're doing so well.
Yeah, I still get nervous going up. I think every time you're putting together new material, you don't know how that material is going to land. You don't know if you're going to be able to bring the audience with you. I think I try when I give talks to try and explain some quite complex ideas and concepts.
Exactly.
For me, is treat the audience with a lot of respect, that that they can grasp a lot of complexity, and I try and lean into that complexity and try and explain it in a way that makes sense to me, without kind of dumbing it down. So that's kind of ambitious, and when you do that for the first time, putting a talk together, you never
Does it
quite know
always
if you.
go the way you want it, or do you have to adjust things as you go?
Yeah, it's kind of like comedy in that sense, right? Like you're kind of always adjusting, and you're like, oh, if I say it like this, it lands a little better. If I say it like that, I can bring the audience along with me. But a lot of this stuff is finding a language to kind of connect with people and to do that through stories. And I think the only thing that I've been able to do is, I don't consider myself like that kind of like special or anything. I'm just like, well, how do I understand this? And if I can understand it, and share my way of understanding it with other people, that just seems to work. And so I'm sort of fortunate that all I do when I get up and talk is I just kind of share how it makes sense to me. And by putting some time and effort into kind of the language and the stories behind that, I'm able to bring people along with me.
Especially because you're so many steps ahead of all of us on these issues. So it's good that you have this ability to explain it to anyone.
Yeah, no, it's sometimes kind of it's funny living out. I don't know. I feel like I'm living sometimes 10 years ahead of where the world is, and things that seem very obvious to me, when I'm looking at it, seem quite novel. And I forget sometimes that that it's kind of unusual. What I'm sharing with people is the first time they've ever heard it, or the first time they've thought about it, and it's been kind of a very consistent part of my world. And so it's interesting. You're sort of, you're bringing people on a journey, and it's a journey that you're sort of, it's a privilege to be able to do that.
Wonderful. And you have accent. You're from New Zealand, right?
Yeah. So yeah, grew up in New Zealand, and still carrying that New Zealand accent. Although my New Zealand friends will tell me it sounds a little bit Australian, or American at this point, but very
I
much from New
asked, I asked ChatGPT, tell me something about New Zealand that most Americans don't know.
Zealand.
And here's what I got. New Zealand has about 5 million people and around 25 million sheep. Five sheep per person.
Yep.
That's
It
an
used
interesting fact.
Yeah, yeah. So when we were growing up, it was 3 million people and 100 million sheep, and so the sheep to person ratio is slowly decreasing. But yeah, it's still a lot of sheep,
I
but
know.
more and more people, which is great.
Yeah, that's great. So I would like to talk about AI, of course. Of course. And you've been working in this field for so long, but most people got very excited about AI in the last year or two. And so many billions of dollars been invested in the AI field in the last year. Do you think we got a little bit overexcited? It seems like people were throwing money without really thinking through, what do I want from this?
Yeah, look, I mean, both can be true, right? Like, people can throw silly money into a space, and there can still not be enough money invested.
Mm.
Where are we? I go back to sort of some of these things, right? The first is operating in the AI space, and this is, I think, true of sort of the informal kind of conversations I have with other founders. We tend to wake up being surprised by what the technology can do.
Even you.
And and it's pretty rare, right, that you're an expert in a space, and you're consistently being surprised by what the technology can do and what it can deliver. So that says to me that we don't know exactly what this can do, because if we knew what it would do, we wouldn't be surprised. So that suggests that there's a lot more to come and a lot more to be done. I think the second bit of evidence on that is every time you dive in to try and improve something with your engineering team, you can generally make improvements fairly easily, right? Like, it's not a question of like, I've got to search for 6 months to find an improvement. You spend a couple of days and you're like, wow, if I change this or I move that, the performance of the system improves. So this all is suggestive of the fact that we're at the bottom of the exponential curve, not near the top where it bends into an S curve. So I would kind of characterize when I talk to people about my position on AI is that we're very much in the early innings of the technology. And this is borne out by the fact that the first research papers putting together the transformer-based architecture only came out in the preprint non-peer-reviewed publications at the end of 2017. So, that is still only 7.5, years ago, which
there
is
were not
very,
too much progress in the beginning, right?
well, no, that speed is exceptional, right? So generally the rule of thumb is it's 10 years from the publication of any research into a commercial application. And with AI, you've gone probably not just kind of within 7 years, but you've got from 7 years into kind of $100 billion companies in multiple districts around the world. And so the speed of this is I think, unprecedented from what we would normally see from the sort of the transmission from science to commercialization. And so that kind of suggests that, early innings, the speed is very, very fast. There's a lot of gains to be made by people operating in the space. So I think it's fair and reasonable that this should attract a lot of capital. I think there's a lot of questions around, how smart that capital is and whether or not the valuations are correct and all of that stuff. But if you were to look at this as a technology that obviously has a huge upside and is very early in its development, this is something, if you were to put money to work, this is probably the right place to do it.
Okay, no, that's good to know. If you could talk a little bit about your company.
So we started Quid in around 2009, and yeah, I mean the big challenge then at that point was big data and how to get huge amounts of data into searchable and queryable formats. And this is obviously a prerequisite for AI because AI runs on the foundation of huge volumes of data. And so for us, with Quid, the challenge was then, well, how do you interact with this data once you've got it? And the piece of that was really around the interactive visualization layer and taking these different lower dimensional projections of high dimensional data and creating a navigable interface. And that was a wonderful kind of challenge technically of how do you create a new user interface, how do you manage the data, but then how do you also do the tricky things like the intuitive nature of the colors and the shapes of your user interface, whilst kind of keeping the latency of the interaction really low so that people could have that feeling of playing with data. And
we were able to data.
Data. Yeah, that's exactly right. And so that idea of just diving into very large data sets, exploring them, playing with them, and trying to find connections inside of that information. And
remember you were saying many years ago that it's like magic. You can see the future if you have good data, right? Data.
Yeah. I mean, look, that's all the stuff is. The future is already here. It's just not very widely distributed. And I think the future is written. The near future is written in the present state of information, and it's probabilistic, right? Like it's not for certain, but if you're going to have something happen tomorrow, there's got to be some things that preceded it today. And if you're looking at enough data, you can start to kind of draw those inferences. And it turns out that there's a lot more predictability in the world once you have access to that huge amounts of data. And in some ways, we're seeing that today with artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence, as we're seeing with these large language models, are predictive machines, right? They're predicting what the next word is going to be based on huge volumes of data. And as they predict that next word, that turns out that it starts to kind of mimic or at least replicate some of the ways in which we would consider human intelligence. And so really what we're looking at in this transition, from when I started Quid through to where we are today, is this kind of collection of data, the accessibility of data, and the use of that data for predictive mechanisms. And, what it turns out is that if you're good at predicting, that seems to correlate pretty well with intelligence as we know it today.
Yeah, and gives you advantage.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, make a lot of money with good predictions.
Right, but again, it seems like we have too much data and not always good.
Yeah, I mean, you can have too much data. Firstly, insofar as you need to know the quality of the data. Where did it come from?
Yeah.
What are the biases within the data? What are the blind spots? Where is data not being collected? And then you've also got to be careful when you're building models on top of that data that you're not over parameterizing them and overfitting and creating signal where perhaps
there's so much to consider.
Not really there. Yeah, and so. As with anything on these things, the tool of prediction from data is incredibly powerful, but like any other tool, you need to kind of know how to operate it and know its capabilities and its limitations.
And your next company is based on AI technology, right?
Yes, we're very early into it with Primer. And so with Primer, when I started that in 2015, at the start of 2015, we were looking at that sort of revolution that had happened in the computer vision space, and we'd seen a lot of deep neural networks achieving state-of-the-art performance on image recognition tasks, and these technologies were, I think, very, very interesting to me at the time. And I was like, the bet I was looking at there was that would transfer over into the language, environment. And so the technologies that were very, very good at generating images and creating and understanding pictures would be able to make a transition to processing language. As soon as we started Primer in that environment, focusing on language, and then took that at the intersection of that plus defense and intelligence, and found the first sets of customers and what became the dominant sets of customers in the intelligence and the defense verticals in the United States. Working
this is very important.
At the intersection. Yeah, working at the intersection of artificial intelligence and defense was I think a mission that was very, very central for me in starting Primer, and was I think a place where we could do a lot of good.
Working with the U.S. government, it seems like the company is definitely making a huge difference. I read that you're helping analysts, right? It's easier for them to navigate their research.
Yeah, so for us, there was a few different applications to technology, but one of the ones that I think was a huge valuable contribution was bringing these AI systems in to allow analysts in defense and intelligence to be able to go through huge volumes of information to make sense of it, to query it. And so if you think of an analyst job inside of an intelligence organization, they could be processing, thousands of documents every single day. And of course, as the internet grows and data capture environment increases, that number is only increasing. But, the speed of human data processing is about 150 words a minute, right? And so we've got a capacity of how much data an intelligence analyst can process against the delta of how much data there is out there. And you close that delta not by throwing more people at the problem, but by bringing technology into it. And so, as you start going through that, you can look, if you're analyzing a region of the world, you can say how many pro-democracy protests have there been in Iran over the last 3 years, and where have they been, and can you give me an estimate of the number of people involved, and were there any consequences for the leaders of those? And so these are all questions that intelligence analysts may be tasked with on any given day, and they normally take certainly hours, if not weeks, of work to kind of assemble that. But you're able to do that.
And their decision, the results of their analysis are extremely important, because very important decisions are being made based on their research.
Yep.
So this is huge, very, very important.
Yeah, the most important decisions, right?
And they don't have time. Sometimes decisions needs to be made now, and if it takes too long, then it's an issue.
And we also found, like, one of the things we talked a lot about, the cost of curiosity. All right, so as an intelligence analyst, you're tasked with questions, but you're also kind of curious. You're like, well, what if there's some information over here, or what if I put this data together, it would tell me something. And the reason is you don't, because you're swamped with all this workload. But it's also very, very expensive to go and follow that trail of curiosity. And by bringing artificial intelligence into that and putting it into the hands of those analysts, you're able to reduce that cost of curiosity massively, and so that you can kind of follow your hunches a little more and follow the intuition that you have as an analyst, because you've got more time on your hands, and you've got a much reduced cost of doing so. And so I view this a lot as this kind of idea of augmenting the analyst workflow with artificial intelligence, as opposed to kind of bringing in this AI and just having it replace every single analyst that's there. And I've long been a proponent that that machines are very good at certain things and humans are good at other things, and the key is to get the symbiosis of the two of those working together properly. And it's not artificial intelligence as much as it's augmented intelligence.
Yeah, I spent many years of my career working in the e-discovery field, so where we would look at large sets of data and try to find evidence.
Yeah, I mean, look, lawyers on e-discovery will be transformed by this technology. I say there hasn't been the next generation company that's sort of AI first that's really got this right just yet. There've been a few players that have kind of got into the space, but nothing that's really taken advantage of this generation of technology. But yeah, I mean, e-discovery is going to undergo a massive transformation, as will a lot of the legal profession.
Exactly.
And indeed, anyone who works with huge volumes of text is going to have their job changed by these technologies. But yeah, I'm keeping an eye out on the e-discovery for litigation. I think there'll be a really interesting company there in the near term.
What do you think is the best application of AI? Maybe in the medical field?
Yeah, I mean,
you think how would it change
yeah,
humanity, or save humanity or help humans? What's the best way to use it? Because we talk a lot about risks, but I think it's so important to talk about this positive side of this amazing technology.
Yeah, I mean, I always go back to my sort of background and grounding as a physicist, and I'm like, I think AI will teach us about the fundamental laws of the universe in ways that would have been inaccessible to us with just the human brain and with the sort of the older kind of tools of calculus and mathematics. I think we're going to see and learn about the fundamental forces of the universe from AI. And I think when I always go back to kind of the biggest impacts that you can kind of have, I mean, AI is available to us because we've harnessed electricity, which is one of the fundamental forces of the universe. And, the electromagnetic forces enable that to happen. And so, I think when you look really big picture, the ability to understand the fundamental forces of the universe and manipulate them in ways to build tools, I think is the biggest thing that we can do as a sort of a conscious civilization, and that will change us more than anything else. And at the moment, gravity is one of those pieces that we don't fully understand, and we don't fully understand how that works. And so we certainly can't, if we don't understand it, we certainly can't manipulate it. But if we rewind the clock 150 years, the same would be true of electromagnetism. We didn't really understand it, and we certainly we were very primitive in our ability to manipulate it. And so, if you sort of want to go really big picture on the stuff, like, I think AI, has the potential to help us kind of understand what gravity really is, and potentially to manipulate gravity, which would which I think would change our whole kind of sense of space and time. That's probably getting out there. If you
But
you want to,
but you don't think that the AI will destroy humanity, no?
Well, look, I think the biggest kind of threat at the moment to humanity is another world war, and those tend to happen when you get two competing superpowers that are fighting for a military offset. And an offset is a technological capability that would render a vastly superior military advantage on the battlefield. And artificial intelligence, unquestionably, in my eyes, is a major military advantage. If you are able to wield AI, you will defeat human-centered or human-only control structures, and we see that in air-to-air combat. We see that in the intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance. We see that in the dynamics of what the next generation of drone capabilities are going to be. So,
when we started to talk about war. And
well, look, that's where these things go, right? Like, people will talk about, oh, maybe AI will destroy us. Well, very clearly, before that happens, we're going to be looking at AI deployed inside of military, and whoever has that upper hand will probably have the dominant military in the world, and will be living under the control structures of that regime. And at the moment, it's not clear whether that's the United States and the Western alliance, or it becomes China and its relationships increasingly with Russia there as well. So I think you're looking at a military arms race with artificial intelligence, not just to discover it, but to deploy it. So that's number one. And if you're on the losing side of that, AI will absolutely destroy certain parts of humanity. I think if we get past that and navigate through this, and we're under a regime that still tolerates technology and artificial intelligence, which again, we may ban or try and ban that, or whoever wins this arms race, then I think you start looking at this kind of dynamic, and I think it's maybe less about whether it will destroy humanity, but it will certainly change humanity. And I think very, very clearly we will start integrating artificial intelligence into the biological systems, and so the line between human and machine will start to blur. We will also start putting more of our humanity into the machines, and so again, the line between human and machine will blur. And so I think it's less about whether or not AI will replace humans, destroy humans, and so on. I think it's very much about AI will unquestionably change humans. But, if you were to wind forward, 1,000 years, it's not clear that we would see ourselves as separate from artificial intelligence. And, if you go back to sort of a foundational technology, which is language. So language is a technology. We didn't always have language. We didn't always speak. There are many animals that don't speak. Of course, we humans developed language, and now we use it. We would consider it very, very difficult to separate our identity from the language that we have. Insofar as I think if people lost the ability not just to speak, but the ability to think in language, we would probably consider ourselves to be somewhat kind of different, right? If you didn't have any, if as a humanity we didn't have any concept of words, and we couldn't express thoughts, and we couldn't have an internal monologue. And so the idea there is we've developed a technology, we've integrated over hundreds of thousands of years, and now we believe it to be so central to our concept of being human, that we could scarcely imagine, ourselves, or even kind of conceive of how to think of ourselves, or even the idea of thinking without language. So if you take this forward 1,000 years or 100,000 years, whatever we become with artificial intelligence, we probably will have the same attachment to it in our identity as we do with language today. And so, I think that's really, really interesting when you think about this. But so much of this becomes this sort of, polar, conflict of humans, machines. How are we going to interact? How are we
going to
versus
merge? Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's probably where this thing lands. And yeah, I mean that's it's not going to be the first time in our history that we've taken technology and integrated it, and it's changed us.
Interesting. We started talking about war, and you have your PhD from Oxford, where you studied mathematics of war. And if you could talk a little bit about it, just to start with, what does it mean?
Yeah, so this was work I started during my PhD back in the mid 2000s.
It's a very unique area.
Yeah, it was. I was in the physics department, computational physics, but I decided that I'd take some risks and start looking, at some of the non-traditional sort of applications. And so, what we were looking at doing was trying to understand and model human behavior at a large scale, and in doing so, look for sort of patterns that would give us an insight into how complex human systems worked. And we started with a few different things, looked at financial markets and did some work in that. We looked at epidemics and the diffusion of both viruses, but also ideas and information. And we looked at biological systems, the swarming behaviors of schools of fish, and the growth of slime molds and the intelligence networks that would form from that. So we looked at a lot of different things. But what really kind of, I think, landed the work on an international scale was when we started applying these techniques into the world of insurgency. And at the time, we were looking at the Second Gulf War, and it was sort of considered, I think, probably one of the most complex problems. There's some famous PowerPoint schematics with that were being shared in the Department of Defense with dozens of different actors and hundreds of different connections and all these different pieces of complexity. It was people saying, well, how is this thing working? The reason that everyone was obsessed with trying to understand how it was working is that you had the strongest military the world has ever seen, the American military, at the height of its technological and financial powers, being taken on and largely defeated by a group of insurgents. And under normal military doctrine, that this shouldn't happen, right? Like, this should not occur. And so the question was going, in this complexity of insurgency, why are they so successful? Why is this working? And so we attacked this problem by going and saying, well, look, let's collect all the data that we can about these attacks and where they're happening and who's committing them and how successful they are and how many people are dying as a result and what weapons are being used and what's the time between the attacks and what's the geographic diffusion of the attacks. And as we went through that, it turned out that far from being random, these attacks followed different mathematical patterns in the distribution of sizes and the timing of the attacks and then the diffusion of the attacks geographically. And what was more than that, so firstly, that by itself was a huge surprise. But the second piece of it was that these patterns that we saw in Iraq were being repeated in other conflicts around the world: Colombia, Sierra Leone, Northern Ireland, and even going back into some of the earlier fights that we were seeing in places like Sparta. And so there seemed to be this kind of pattern of irregular warfare, that successful irregular warfare campaigns or insurgency campaigns would all exhibit very similar mathematical patterns in the timing, size, and location of the attacks across the environment they were being fought. And what kind of came from that was we say, all right, now we've got the statistical patterns. Now we can build some models in how insurgents are forming groups, making decisions, allocating resources, and we can do it in a decentralized way. And it turns out that as we built these models, we were able to replicate the statistical patterns that we're observing across these different conflict zones. And so in doing that, there's a few different things that we found, but the first is you've got a decentralized network. You're communicating through the broadcasting of successful strategies. Groups, when they're attacked, they tend to fragment, and those fragmented pieces rejoin other groups that are deemed to be successful. You've got high dimensional communication between these groups. And you've got localized incentives and reward structures that are operating inside of that. You've also got this technology curve and this learning rate that's built in of people adapting to new strategies that they're copying from their neighboring insurgent groups and bringing those to bear on the thing. And so the speed of innovation inside of that was immense. And it was very, very resilient to attacks that the US forces were putting onto those groups. And so with that, you were then able to come back and then start to kind of like run different scenarios. And it turned out that if you were to like focus your attacks on the groups sort of the middle tier of groups, not the large ones or the small ones, but the middle ones, it was actually a really effective strategy for defeating an insurgency. And the reason for that was it meant that the innovation that was emerging in the small groups would never make its way to the large groups. Secondly, the large groups would never be fragmented, they'd never be broken apart, and their learnings wouldn't diffuse back to the small groups. And you sort of stop the evolution of this ecosystem. And so it was quite a change in protocol, because all the other attacks were attacking the large groups in places like Iraq, but you actually wanted to leave them alone and really focus on the mid-sized groups as a more effective counterinsurgency strategy. So yeah, there's a lot to sort of unpack inside of that, but I think overall we're able to kind of start to understand how this ecosystem was working, why it was successful, and also start to kind of simulate ways to defeat it. And that was the first time I think anyone had really brought that level of computational sophistication to warfare.
But is it being used or taught at the universities nowadays? I know it's a while ago, right?
Yeah, so right from the early days, like I would go and brief the commanders going out at West Point, the young officers that were about to leave. They were probably the most hungry. They knew that they were going out. They had their teams to protect, and they really wanted to understand those groups. We spent time with the Deputy Prime Minister of Iraq and the ambassadors, helping them understand the nature of the insurgency they were fighting. And also many briefings, both in United Nations, the Pentagon, and helping kind of many different groups understand, what we were seeing and more importantly, the approach that we were taking. And so now from that, you've got hundreds of citations of that work, and you've got a whole discipline now of analyzing conflict with a mathematical lens that just, look, when we submitted this work into the journal Nature, and we ultimately got it published on the cover of Nature, but when we started that, they said, look, this is political science. This is not something you do in a hard scientific journal. You should go look elsewhere. This is not this is not for us. And so we were confronted with that, as we submitted this work. It's a good reminder that, this was really out of left field. Like this was the question they were basically is like, you don't belong here, right? This is not something that is done. And now that's obviously gone. And there was a couple of years ago, the first Nobel Prize for the work of complexity was awarded. And, this kind of idea that you can use mathematics to study large scale human systems is now, accepted. It just took 20 years to really get it to that place. And, we were certainly one of the groups right at the front of that, breaking down some of those barriers.
So you understand so much about wars. Let me ask you about the war in Ukraine, because I was born in Russia. I grew up in Ukraine, and I moved to the United States 20 years ago. So the situation in Ukraine is breaking my heart, to say the least. I'm a mother. I have 2 children. My kids are 15 and 20, and I can only imagine parents in Ukraine sending their children to fight in this war is just terrible. It's terrible. We want this war to end. And, Ukraine is a small country compared to Russia. And I wanted to ask you, do you think with new technologies we have in the world, and they're being created every single day, right? There are some breakthroughs, especially with drones. Do you think it's even possible for a smaller country like Ukraine to win Russia? Of course, there's always a nuclear threat that changes the conversation completely. But I just wanted to ask about your take on this. What do you think? Or it's all about numbers, because if it's about numbers, it's about soldiers. Russia has so many people that there's no way Ukraine could win. And it's not only about Russia and Ukraine. We don't want big guys coming in and starting wars where they feel somebody has less soldiers, smaller army. And actually, many, many countries in Europe have very small armies. That's why they're trying to get together and protect each other.
Yeah, I mean, look, there's a lot to unpack amongst all of this. I mean, I think first and foremost, I think it's a wake-up call for Europe, and that is indeed kind of radiating out around the world, that the relative safety that we've enjoyed in a world of Pax Americana, with America kind of providing the sort of de facto policing structure for the Western world, is fast coming to an end. And that means that people in authoritarian regimes are going to look to cement their positions, and they're going to look to do that by expanding their territories. And that's exactly what we saw firstly with Crimea, and then with the second full-on invasion into the heartland of Ukraine. But it's not only going to be Russia. I mean, we're seeing that spill out into the Middle East. We're certainly going to see elements of this, I think, unfold in different territorial regions around China. And indeed, you can make the argument that in the South China Sea, we're already seeing it today. And then, you could also make arguments and cases, for different regions of the world. So I think what we're seeing is a changing of the political power structures that we've enjoyed, with the US being the number one superpower, and now with China rising and America's reluctance to kind of get involved, all of a sudden the security environment that we've enjoyed is changed. So that's number one, right? Number two is there's a technology piece of this that's unfolding, right? So you're getting a changing geopolitical structure against a changing technological structure. And I think that the use of artificial intelligence inside of the Ukraine theater of battle is very minimal. I've spent time with a number of the Ukrainian technologists and defense officials there, and I think there's a sense of what can it do, and how do we use it? But I would say it is very, very small today in terms of that being used. However, the technology that is kind of coming in, I think, is two pieces, and one which we know about and we can discuss is the drone aspect to this. These drones are human controlled. They're not they're not autonomous. They're not AI controlled. They're starting to integrate artificial intelligence into the capabilities for targeting and some navigational abilities, but that's still very, very early. But the one that I think people forget on this is information warfare and information operations. And I think the bet that Russia made when they invaded was that it would be a relatively straightforward operation because Ukraine was not going to stand up and fight. And I think from where they were looking, that may have been a reasonable assumption for the Russian commanders, but there was a masterful work in rallying support, both nationally in Ukraine and also internationally, and that was, not an accident, right? Like there was some very sophisticated tactics at work in creating narratives, shaping stories, distributing and disseminating that information. And, that really solidified, I think, the will to fight. And people always forget, I think, that, you can have all the military technology you want and all the numbers, but if you can't get consensus that it's a war worth fighting, you will lose every single time. And so, I think the information operations was incredibly valuable, and Ukraine beat Russia hands down on information operations. Like the Russian information and manipulation of the Ukraine population was very, very much defeated by the Ukraine work. So that's I think two places here in this conflict that we're seeing technologies, the information operations, and the second piece is being these unmanned vehicles, which are human controlled, but will soon be AI controlled. So I think you've got that technological aspect, and then the final bit is you've now got sort of this idea of cementing and forming alliances, right? And Russia very clearly has picked up North Korean troops. That's not North Korea, that's China. And the reason I say it's China is because nothing happens in North Korea with regards to military without China's approval. And China has not just approved this. I don't think there was a request from North Korea saying, can we please send our troops here? I think it was, you will send your troops here, and this is what's going to happen. And so China on that has enabled a huge influx of soldiers into that regime, and it also gives them the ability to put Chinese soldiers into the theater with plausible deniability and cover. And so what you've got is a broadening of this conflict with boots on the ground from Ukraine into or Ukraine versus Russia into Ukraine versus Russia and China and North Korea and so on. Now, on the other side, of course, you've had weapons technology capabilities from the US, long range, medium range missiles coming in, aircraft, tanks coming out of Germany. And so you're getting battle lines drawn across alliances. And so Ukraine at the moment is, and I think in the future will be looked at as the forming and cementing of alliances that will start to kind of shape the next major power struggle in the world. And what's interesting at the moment is firstly, as China, I think, has taken a significant step with the North Korean request. And I think where the jury's out at the moment is where United States will play, which is really about the United States' relationship with Europe. And United States' relation with Europe, and that's wrapped up in NATO and that. And I think, there's enough uncertainty into that, which is coming to kind of the minds of the French, the Germans, the Swedes, the Finns, the Poles, that they're all ramping up their military expenditure with the belief that, the US has a very good chance that it won't be there. And so I think a China-Russia nexus without the US involvement is going to be very difficult for Europe to win in its current state. But this, unfortunately, won't be the last conflict. I think it's very, very unlikely that, however Ukraine conflict resolves, and I hope it's a victory for democracy. But however it resolves itself, this won't be the last. And I think that the onus is on Europe to really invest heavily in technology to enable them to compete effectively against this Russian-Chinese alliance, with the expectation the US may or may not be there at their side.
Yeah, nobody wins, because there are hundreds of thousands of people already lost their lives. It's a very, very sad situation, unfortunately. So what you're saying, we have the best technology in the world here in the US. I believe so. I don't know maybe you would disagree with me. We don't know what China is doing now. I think they.
Let's touch on that for a second. It's actually a really interesting question, right? Who's winning the military technology race? And yeah, look, I think if you roll into artificial intelligence and take that subset of the question, who's winning the AI arms race, China or the US? I think the US is probably developing more cutting edge technology, and is certainly publishing, some very interesting work. What's interesting is China has closed that gap massively. That arguably the publications and the breakthroughs that are happening more out of Chinese universities now than the US ones. US, obviously still has under its control the chips and the manufacturing of the capabilities of the latest generation of 3 nanometer fabrication and that, but that's up for grabs because Taiwan is where all of that is produced.
Yeah.
And it's not clear that the US is going to be able to defend Taiwan. And so the one major advantage the US has is its supply of chips for these things. The publication, the research is 50-50. Like, it's hard to say which is better.
Interesting.
And
they're stealing a lot of our intelligence, which is
that's
terrible.
right. I mean, sort of the rumor was going around, I won't say which company, but a very, very prominent AI company about 18 months ago, there was I think very credible rumors that had the entirety of their weights for their neural networks had been stolen by an inside agent. And I think the US companies were naive to the industrial espionage that was and is going on today.
But now we're keeping our eyes on it, right?
Well, no, I don't think so. I think our defense systems, the Silicon Valley still operates in this bubble as though it has no impact from the outside geopolitical forces. And there are a large number of Chinese CCP assets that are operating in Silicon Valley today that are embedded in companies and are almost certainly taking industrial IP back across the border. And so it's very interesting seeing how fast China is at following some of these breakthroughs. But all of that is kind of I think secondary to implementation. And what you're seeing from China is the AI research that is being done is very, very focused on military applications. And so if you look at things like computer vision and targeting and navigation and autonomous swarm systems, all the major research that is being done on that, or at least 90% of the work, I think, based on kind of what I'm reading, is coming out of Chinese universities. It is not coming out of the US universities. The US universities obviously doing huge amounts of stuff in generative AI and large language models and all of that. But the application of that technology directly into conflict is not as apparent as
we need to reach this gap, right, between Silicon Valley
to bridge that gap. So where China is focusing on their AI efforts has a very, very clear line of sight to implementation in the military. And the US AI research has a much looser line. And you only have to rewind the clock, 5 or 6 years when Google employees literally threatened to pick up their laptops, throw them into the San Francisco Bay and never work again if Google were to take a contract from the Department of Defense, right? Like that kind of employee activism and reluctance to engage in anything security or defense orientated is not something you see in China, right? And so the sort of the political climate and the social climate and the social license to operate a defense focused application in the Valley is changing, but we're playing catch up to China on that regard. And I think the jury's out as to who has the upper hand. I've given this talk a few times to kind of briefings of senior defense officials around the world, and just kind of running through the state of play of where the arms race in artificial intelligence is. And each time we kind of check in on that, I think the most charitable thing you can say is it's a 50-50 toss up as to who's going to win this. And that has severe ramifications for the world that we live in. And I think people don't fully appreciate that whoever controls artificial intelligence, the cutting edge artificial intelligence, will control the dominant military in the world. And who controls the dominant military in the world will control the political system that the majority of us live under. And, that sort of urgency and immediacy, we sort of talked at the start of this thing of feeling like we're living kind of, 5-10 years in the future.
You need to prepare another TED Talk. I think this is so important.
That's kind of where I feel like I'm living, and I'm at the moment. It's kind of, the conversation seems to be whether a super intelligence will destroy humanity, and I'm like, guys, we've got a much more immediate problem, which is whoever controls dominant AI is going to control the world that we live in, and that's going to happen well before anything else. With anything else with AI destroying humanity comes to the level. So, yeah, look, I think that's there. I do think this next 12 months, if I'm putting my sort of prediction hat on, I think there will be much more investment by the US into defense technology. I think a lot more startups in Silicon Valley will start to realize this is an incredibly important mission, and came to the same conclusion that I came to when I started Primer, that if you're going to spend your time building something, building for the defense of democracy is an incredibly important mission, and it's I think a lot of other people are going to come to that conclusion. I think the second one that we're going to see here is we're going to see a lot more AI experimentation, and unfortunately in Ukraine, I don't see that coming to a close, and even if there is peace negotiated there, it's hard to see there not being a kind of a counterinsurgency or an insurgency movement continuing to, when you see with conflicts, is
it doesn't stop in one day.
It doesn't stop. Too many people have lost families, have lost things, and will be unwilling to kind of put down arms. But you're going to see more AI experimentation, and so I think we're going to see the first sets of autonomous targeting capabilities where AI on the drones are going to be able to identify targets, and it's not going to be solely human controlled. I think you're going to see another step up, probably not from Russia, but from China, in terms of information operations and information warfare. We tend to talk about this a lot. We talk about it as a fake news and misinformation, but I think that's minimizing what it really is. It's information operations, and at the moment there's a bill looking to be ratified in the US around TikTok. People are again appreciating this. You've got a CCP controlled organization that is the dominant form of information for not just every soldier in the US military, but the dominant form of information for large part of the population under the age of 40, controlled by the CCP. I mean, put it another way, if a US company controlled the information the Chinese people received, China would not let that stand. And we're a bit different because
it was created specifically for United States and other countries because they don't use this.
They don't use it themselves.
Can you imagine us creating something?
And then this is again, it's not fully appreciated what they've got, but this is probably the biggest intelligence capability that we've seen in the last 30 years, which is you can kind of shape and control the worldview of an entire population. And you can do that by exposing them to different kinds of information or not showing them other kinds of information. There's been really interesting research into the prevalence of information on TikTok on certain political themes versus other channels like Instagram. And once you start looking at the data, it's very, very clear that there is a manipulation of that information, of that wing. Now, it's interesting because it's not censorship, so they haven't banned this stuff, right? It's not banned. You can still find free to bet on TikTok. It's just its prevalence is 95% less than you would see on other networks, and so TikTok is able to kind of put their hand up and say, we don't censor information. But what's harder to do is to say, we don't manipulate information. And they just say, oh, it's just the algorithm. But when you look at this, obviously, China has a long history of censoring and manipulating information. And now they control the information platform that the majority of Americans use to kind of shape their view of the world, whether they are conscious of it or not. And so this here at the moment is going to be a real test for the American Trump administration as to what they do with us, and whether or not the Republican-sponsored bill to nationalize the technology back is not to get rid of TikTok. It's just saying it can't be run by the CCP. And I say run by the CCP. Oh, but its CEO is a Singaporean and so on. It's like, yeah, I'm sure we can have a conversation about how that really works. But that's going to be fascinating, right? So information operations vis-a-vis China, and then the adoption of defense technology as a mission by Silicon Valley, and then the battlefield of experimentation that is underway, led by, I would say Ukraine has been the most fast moving of that, is going to kind of continue to accelerate. And so, I think all of that stuff is going to unfold there. But what we're looking at here is, unfortunately, Ukraine is just in a place where it's found itself at the nexus of a bunch of competing forces, and it reminds me of the sort of space which is just, you hope it's not going to be you when this thing comes. But I mean, if it was going to end quickly, it would have ended. And I think, and if we come back and have this conversation in 2 years' time, it'll be the same thing. I don't see this ending quickly.
That's interesting that you're saying this. And I think I wanted to highlight one issue, something that you just mentioned, that that the United States is collecting intelligence, testing those drones in Ukraine, because now, after almost 3 years of war, most Americans don't even want to help Ukraine. Like, we send too much money, there's nothing there for us. Why do we even need to be there? But I wanted to highlight these things that actually help America, right, to improve our technology, learn about Russian technology.
I can assure you the defense officials are looking very, very closely at the strategies that are emerging from the battlefield in Ukraine. And Ukraine and the people that are standing up to fight there are doing things with technologies that the US has not even thought possible, or not even created war games around. And so they are looking very, very closely at this. And I think it is changing a lot of the defense procurement in terms of the emergence of the replicator program, which is a huge program for autonomous vehicles that's coming online. I think it's changed the nature of intelligence collection. I know how intelligence is collected and how surveillance and reconnaissance is being done is being changed by what we're learning from Ukraine. And then I think also, like, cognitive security, right? The ability to kind of protect a population from outside information operations is something that I think people are looking at very closely inside of that. So I think all of that is unfolding. I think obviously China is looking not just closely, but I think it's fair to say, there is highly likely that there are many Chinese leaders, military leaders, that have direct lines of communication to their North Korean counterparts on the ground, or they may even be on the ground themselves. And so, this kind of dynamic here is, again, like, it's not about who has the best AI, it's who is able to best integrate that into a defense apparatus. And I think obviously whoever can do that in the battlefield is going to create an advantage. And if I'm the US here, I say, look, get the best technology to the hands of the people fighting in Ukraine. This is good for democracy. It's the right thing to do. And
that's interesting that you're saying this, because it seems to me that we gave all the old stuff that we don't need so we can produce the newer stuff. I feel like if we gave, all the best stuff, they would be able to, I don't know if they would be able to win, but at least save more lives.
Yeah, so look, you'd be able to protect a democracy and keep a country, there and probably reduce the number of people dying significantly. Yeah. And they've been reluctant to give the traditional technologies. But I think that the strategy here would be to give the experimental technologies and put into the hands of the soldiers on the ground and let them use that technology to do what they do best, which is reconfigure it for their advantage. And so maybe there's a pathway there which allows sort of the traditional technologies of war, the long range missiles and that to kind of stay in America's hands. But the more experimental AI drone technology to come in. Now, the issue on that is this has not been traditionally a place where America has led the world, right? Like China has led the world in this technology, and so it's interesting. Yeah, absolutely right. The major drone manufacturers in the world are Chinese. The major research being done on drones is Chinese. America has not embraced that to the same level. So the thing, if I'm America on this, is like, I not only do I want to get very good at this, but I also want to not only do I want to get very good at making the technology, I want to get very good at operationalizing the technology.
Yeah.
And so getting that into the hands of people in the field.
Getting that feedback.
Yeah. Getting that feedback, right? And so, because this won't be the last conflict that's fought with this technology, and it won't be the last one America has to deal with. So, yeah, I mean, selfishly for America, they should be very, very supportive of getting in and doing this. The other bit there is the lot of the talking points that America has, you hear people in America have is very, very similar to the stated goals of the information operations campaign coming out of Russia, right? Which very clearly, and this was an FBI investigation that came through with Operation Doppelganger. And Operation Doppelganger outlined the key kind of methods, techniques, technologies for engaging the European audience and the American audience in information operations. And so when you hear this kind of, we hear the kind of retort, it is very, very similar to the stated goals of the information operations from Russia. So, how much of these ideas are yours? How much of them are really, what you believe? And, who has got a vested interest in having you believe something else? And this is kind of where we go into this kind of concept. We talk a lot about, physical security. We know that. We talk about cybersecurity, right? You defect, you things. What we haven't talked a lot about is cognitive security. And cognitive security is what defense mechanisms have you got to ensure that the ideas that you have, the thoughts that you have, the beliefs that you hold are not going to be susceptible to a malicious campaign to change them. And, cognitive security is something we've thought very, very little about. And, it's a hard one for a democracy to think about, right? Because the foundation of a democracy is the freedom of press, the freedom of ideas, the freedom of debate, the freedom to hold a belief that is different from someone else's. But at the same time, you're not free to hold a belief if someone else is manipulating your belief. That is not freedom. And if you don't take active measures to secure your thoughts, your cognitive beliefs, then you are susceptible. And I think the population is a lot more susceptible to cognitive information attacks than we give than we would ever imagine. And so,
how do you deal with this?
Well,
how do
first
you
thing
address it? I think we need to be informed about this issue, and then we'll be able to make better decisions, right? Individually, because you don't want government to get involved in this conversation.
It's interesting, right? So, there's this sort of argument. So there's an asymmetry, right? So one of the things here is if you're an authoritarian regime that controls information, you've obviously got control structures. Your ideology doesn't depend on the freedom of ideas and the debate and so on. It depends on different things. So you've got an advantage, right, in the information, the cognitive security space, is that you can control information. You do control information. Whereas a democracy is freedom of ideas, freedom of expression, freedom of thought, and any kind of government control on that is actually quite detrimental to that set of beliefs. So what do you do when there is an attack?
Maybe social media companies can identify those campaigns and announce that there's a campaign was identified, and maybe describe what it's about. The people, they can read whatever they want, but at least they'll keep in mind that it was artificially created.
Well, it's very, very hard though to do a few different things, right? The first is that only addresses false positives, right? So I said this, but it's not true. It doesn't deal with false negatives, right? So what should you have told me, but I did? What should I have heard, but I didn't hear, right? And so the absence of information, like the fact checking, doesn't deal with the absence of information. The second thing is there are a lot of things in the world where it's not clear what the answer is, and you can't police every statement because we don't know the answer to everything. You say, well, if someone says gravity is the result of the interactions of dark matter, and you're like, well, I don't know, maybe it is. We don't know. And so am I allowed to hold that belief because we haven't proven it to be true? It's like, so once you're into this everything that you say is going to be fact checked, I mean, that's ridiculous. And then if you say something
on Twitter and X community notes, right? They're trying.
So the community notes is really interesting. The other one is in Wikipedia, right, where you have the community discussing, here's why I believe this, here's why is there. And if you go into kind of the basis of this, it's not the freedom to hold any belief, it's the freedom to change your belief, right? And I think we talk about the freedom of speech, but I think what it really is the freedom to change your speech. And with the freedom to change your speech means it's also a responsibility that, upon new information and new beliefs, you should change your speech. You should change your beliefs.
Absolutely.
And something that sort of got entrenched into kind of, I must have the freedom to hold the belief and never change it. And, it's like, yes, but the real freedom here is to change. And through change means you can disagree, and you can disagree with yourself. But to do that, you need to engage in debate, and you need to engage in new information, and you need to engage in perhaps
be exposed to different point of view,
right? And so, but you also need to be very
people tend to block it,
that's
bubbles, right. And this is what I believe in.
That's right. And so like this kind of space there is crowds can be very stupid, or they can be very, very smart. There can be a huge amount of wisdom in crowds, but a lot of it depends on how you have them interact with each other. And the wisdom of crowds works when people have access to different information and are able to form their own opinions without being kind of dragged along by what the majority already believes. But they're also very, very susceptible to manipulation, and the beliefs that you have and the beliefs that a society holds are very vulnerable. And this is something that we haven't really thought about, because democracy's never really been under attack, in our lifetimes. And we've never really had the sort of the belief structure of a society being targeted before. But there is certainly the technology and the scale of distribution in platforms like TikTok to run that operation. And if you can do it, you got to believe that the people in the CCP are experimenting with this. And So look, cognitive security, I think, is something we should all take on. And one of the bits on this is, you need to know where your information is coming from, and you need to
check different sources.
But not just the information that you're seeing, the information that you're not seeing,
Mm.
and not just whether the information was true or not, but if I'm continually being exposed to a bunch of true information about crime in my neighborhood, I'm going to think there's more crime in my neighborhood. Whether or not crime is increased, if I'm seeing more of it being reported, I'm going to believe my environment is more dangerous. And it's not that the information was wrong. It was just that the amount of information that I'm seeing is not consistent with the view of the world that I should have. And so now you're into this thing of like, we're focused on, is this right or is this wrong? But what you're really saying is, the information I'm getting, what view of the world do I have? And now you come and you say, well, if the algorithms are serving this information up, what objective or motivation do they have? Now, in the world that we've been in, it's mostly been to attract my attention and to get me to buy stuff. But that's because American capitalist companies have been running that, right? So it's been Facebook and it's been Instagram and Twitter and so on. Now you've got Twitter being owned by a,
Elon Musk.
Yes, I was going to use some different words, but yes, Elon, and he's got his own motivations. You've got TikTok, owned ostensibly, by a Chinese-based Singaporean-based Chinese leader, but really being run by the CCP. And now you start looking at that and saying, well, what are their motivations, and what goals do they have? And very clearly, some of the stuff is like, we don't want you talking about Tiananmen Square. We don't want you talking about a free Tibet. Very clearly you can see that stuff. But what else is going on in that? And so I think when you think about cognitive security, you need to move beyond misinformation and fake news and start thinking about, well, the information I'm consuming, who's controlling the algorithms that are serving this to me, and what motivations do they have? And then how am I building resiliency into that? And one of the ways to do this is to not use algorithms that you don't control, because how could I possibly know of all the information that I'm seeing on TikTok whether or not this was the right reflection of the world that I'm living in? The second thing is, so limit the algorithms that are serving you information. The second thing is provide space for debate with people that disagree with you, and engage and have a reward structure that allows for common ground to emerge, right? So engage in debate, find environments that allow for engagement debate towards a constructive thing. And one of the things with community notes, Wikipedia comments page, is they actually have a community which has a reward structure, which is consensus. And when you get different people with a reward structure around consensus, you actually get interesting spaces. And this is what you get in scientific communities. For the most part, everyone that's in science wants to push knowledge forward. They don't always agree very much. They don't agree with each other, but there is a space where they say we will come together with a shared goal of a common understanding, even if we disagree to start with. And the final bit there is I think decouple a little bit from the here and now.
And you don't have to agree in the end too, just to be aware of that different opinion. You can still hold your belief.
Yeah, that's right. But you've actively got to seek that out, right? Because the way that these platforms are created at the moment is if you start coming into people that disagree with you, it's actually a very unpleasant experience, right? And so this is about, again,
Spaces, I think, good X spaces that people speak live from all over the world.
Yeah, it's funny. Once you put people live, it changes the dynamic again. But the other bit here is most of the things that we get kind of worked up on today that create division on a long enough period of history are irrelevant, right? They're just not that important. And one of the things to go back through and say, look, if I still read anything about this issue in 50 years time, would a historian record this? And one way to kind of do that is to say, well, look, I don't know, I'm not sure, but what I do know is that people today are writing about history, and I can go and read that and go and understand that. And I think one way to get out of, or to kind of get out of some of this information, what is effective in information war zone, is to go back and to go either into the future with science fiction or to go into the past with history. And Silicon Valley does a great job with science fiction. I think it some of the best kind of ideas come from science fiction, and we read science fiction vicariously. But what we do a terrible job of is history. All right. And one of the things that I've been fortunate enough to do in this last 12 months with some time and space that I've been lucky enough to have is just dive into history. And it's been wonderful to get to kind of, I think you spend your time living at the kind of the bleeding edge of technology. But for me, I'm being able to go back and dive in, to history, an older history from 500, 700, 1200, Western Europe, Southern Europe, and
did you find something surprising?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a lot there which we sort of have blind spots. All the historians will sort of look at me and say, well, we know all this, right? But the technologists, we don't know this, right? We live in the future. So as a technologist coming back into the history, there's a lot of stuff to learn. But one of the things that was really fascinating for me was kind of the diffusion of information through time. And, this sort of study, which has been very interesting, of like what original Greek text do we still have? And the answer is very little, right? Very, very little Greek text is actually survived the 2,000 years. And the reason it doesn't survive is because you have to continually rewrite it. It has to survive a whole bunch of censorship. So people, particularly religious groups,
fires, wars, everything.
Wars, burning, looting, but also censorship. So you get the you get kind of the religious zealots come in and say, we'll no longer be able to think of this or see this, but it's got to be burned. And so that happens over a 2,000-year period, and you get a very small information that's kind of left. And what's interesting is what does survive is you see some of the mathematics survives, you see some of the astronomy survives, but half of all the information we've got is from a single writer, which is Galen writes, and it's medical. And what we kept was medical information because, despite your religious beliefs, you still wanted to stay alive, regardless of what you thought about the God and the afterlife. You wanted to be, so again, and with the mathematics, you wanted with Euclid, you wanted your buildings to stand up, and with the astronomy of Ptolemy, you wanted to forecast the auspicious movement of the planets, so you could kind of control your power, and so that information stays.
Poems probably. Like
but
poems, because people fall in love.
Yeah, that's right. But then all the tragedies and the plays and all of that gets kind of banished because at different times it's not around. And so what's fascinating is we think about this kind of transition that we're in now, which is information transitioning into these AI systems. And some of the lessons from this is that most information won't make it over a 2,000-year period. Most of the things that we write and create and make will not make it. And it seems very strange because we live in a world where we think there's an abundance of data and it's very easy to kind of move it and so on. But history tells us that most of it won't make it. And it won't make it not because it couldn't make it, is because we don't want it to make it. And we say, like, this information is censored, this information is not available. And we're in this thing where we're transitioning information from the written form and the visual form into these AI forms. And, I think more should be done to study the lessons of that history. As we start
How do we preserve something, we want to preserve, to leave some mark.
Well, but it's not just preserving, right? It's you have to, because people actively go and seek out the information and destroy it. And so, again, it's part of this dynamic where you move from a sort of an environment of safety into one of hostility. And when you have a hostility-based mindset, you start thinking about security. And it's the same with the cognitive security, right? We've been in a world where no one has really been attacking sort of the ideals and ideas and the ideologies behind democracy. But now that they are, you need to think about security again. And, you go back to the reason we've got all these beautiful castles over Europe is because the nobility had to build walls around themselves to defend themselves. It's not because they loved the architecture, at least early on. No. It was because they were scared. They're scared, and they needed to build security. And they did that because you have the fall of an empire, and you have the devolvement into different warring factions, and there's no sort of control structure. And we're looking at an environment now where the US control structure is fading, and or at least is losing appetite. And you need to start thinking about the security structures. And again, the one that we have today that hasn't really ever been a problem historically has been cognitive security. But again, like, part of this dynamic is like, go and spend time looking at history. I mean, it's not that to go back to the early part of our conversation, it's not going to give you a straight line to predict the future, but it's going to give you some data points that you can draw some inferences from. And I think technologists, maybe rightly so, we spend all this time focusing on STEM and getting very, very good at building technology, but
you're diving into history now. Yeah. I'm curious to see what will come out of this. You're taking this time to focus on. You start some new company, something completely unexpected.
Yeah, look, it's there. It's right. I mean, I've been able to kind of go in and some of the most, that's been on the intellectual side, but on the practical side, it's been nice. I've been able to go and work and as an advisor for some very interesting companies. There's one out here in New Zealand called Dawn Aerospace, which is building hypersonic planes, and it's been fantastic for that. We just broke the supersonic barrier a couple of weeks ago, which is the first time that any commercial aircraft has flown supersonic since the Concorde. So wonderful to kind of get into some of the hardware and certainly military applications with these kinds of things. And so at the moment, keep myself busy on reading history, but also coming into some of these hardware defense based organizations and trying to help from an advisory perspective. And it gives me a good excuse to kind of dive in and see how some of this technology is working, not on the software, but on the physical hardware, because as good as the AI is on the software, if you're going to build a hypersonic plane, you've still got to get in and build a hypersonic plane, and AI is not going to do all that for you. So yeah, look, it's some interesting times, but there's probably a lot to a lot more to be done.
I don't want to take too much of your time, but I wanted to ask you one question. I tried to ask all my guests at the end of this podcast: what does kindness mean to you? It's completely unrelated, but it is actually related to everything.
I think kindness. There's a few pieces that come into this, but I'm always kind of the belief that if it doesn't really cost you anything to give, it's not really kindness. I think it has to have a cost to you, and I think that to sort of look at the real acts of kindness that come through, I think, is to look at, well, what did it cost to hold this, to hold the set of values, to hold these beliefs, and to bring these beliefs into the world. And I think kindness, so that's one, is it has to have a cost. If it didn't really cost you, I think you have to question whether it was really kindness. I think the second piece of this is to do so, and it's kind of related to that cost, right? Is to do so with the sense of really checking yourself and saying, what benefit, do I get from this, right? And I think that sort of piece there is not to say that there should never be a benefit, because you can have things, but I think it's to just really examine, what benefit do I get from this? This is very sort of game theoretical from a sort of a cost-benefit perspective. But look, ultimately...
No, you're taking it from this analytical point of view. I love it.
Yeah, but ultimately kindness is I think it's this connection between consciousness, and not just human consciousness, but connection between consciousness and an appreciation that beyond us and beyond kind of the individual nature of us, there is this kind of connection through consciousness. And I think kindness is ultimately, manifested through that connection of consciousness that is beyond us, that is linking us in ways that we don't know and can't fully understand, and just sort of submitting to this kind of unknownness that there's something beyond me, and I'm not getting any benefit from this, but yet it's costing me something, but I'm doing so because there's a belief that there's a connection, and that connection is more important than anything that I've got as an individual, and it's that sort of winding back to this belief that there's more here than we know, and there's more here that we can know, and we may never know, and trusting that is beyond us, and submitting to that, I think, allows you to kind of bring kindness into your world. And so I think it's hard to be kind without submitting to a belief of a higher power or higher structure beyond the individual. So to be kind is to believe that there's more in the world than just you.
Wonderful. Thank you for your kindness. Thank you for taking your time to connect with me today.
My pleasure.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for sharing all your ideas.